South China Sea, November 1943. The night is calm, but the ocean breathes with tension. A Japanese convoy pushes northward, its ships cloaked in dim blue lights, their engines echoing through the vast, indifferent darkness. Crates of oil, rubber, and rice, and the Empire's lifeblood, rest deep in their holds. Above deck, sailors smoke in silence, scanning a horizon that seems endless. Below, somewhere in that same Black Sea, steel ghosts are listening. An American submarine, USS Harder, glides through the depths, silent as a shadow. The crew whispers over sonar echoes, then a single metallic ping, a heartbeat, a decision. Torpedo away. Moments later, the ocean erupts. Columns of flame tear through the night as one freighter splits in two. Men scramble for the water. Oil burns on the surface, and the once proud convoy scatters into chaos. That single strike was more than destruction. It was revelation. For the first time, Japan's commanders realized that the Empire's greatest weakness did not lie in battle fleets or air bases. It lay beneath the waves. In the early years of the Second World War, Imperial Japan ruled the seas of the Pacific with an iron grip. From the moment the sun rose over Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japan's war machine surged outward with precision and confidence. In just 6 months, their forces seized the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies. Battleships and aircraft carriers, symbols of raw might, defined Japan's power and pride. Behind these victories stood a doctrine that had shaped Japanese naval thinking for decades: Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle philosophy. Born from studies of the Russo-Japanese War and reinforced by years of fleet exercises, this belief centered on a single, climactic naval engagement, where Japan's superior ships and courage would destroy any enemy fleet that dared to challenge them. The Imperial Navy was built for that duel. Every vessel, every commander, every tactic pointed toward one destiny: a grand surface battle. But beneath that surface lay a blind spot. Japan's submarines, some of the most advanced in the world at the time, were never meant to hunt merchant ships or choke enemy logistics. They were designed as scouts, sent ahead of the battle fleet to locate enemy warships or strike isolated targets. Commerce warfare, the kind that had crippled Britain's enemies in the Atlantic, was dismissed as dishonorable, even wasteful. To Japanese strategists, victory came from sinking carriers and battleships, not cargo ships. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, the U.S. Navy entered the war with its own flaws. In 1942, American submarines were plagued with malfunctioning torpedoes. Magnetic detonators failed, contact triggers jammed, and depth controls ran erratically. Crews risked everything only to see their shots run deep or explode prematurely. Frustration spread through the ranks of the silent service. Commanders filed reports. Admirals doubted them. For nearly 2 years, the U.S. submarine force fought a technical battle before it could fight the real one. And so through 1942, Japan's merchant fleet sailed with little fear. Tankers and cargo ships moved freely between newly conquered territories, carrying oil from Borneo, rubber from Malaya, and bauxite from the Dutch East Indies. Every drop of fuel and ounce of ore fed Japan's expanding empire, keeping its aircraft in the skies and its warships at sea. Tokyo believed this would last. Yet as the empire expanded, its needs multiplied. Thousands of miles separated its industrial heart from the resources it consumed. Every island captured added distance, exposure, and vulnerability. Japan's navy had been built for decisive combat, but not for protection. Escort ships were scarce. Anti-submarine training was minimal. Convoy organization was haphazard. Still, confidence persisted. The victories of 1942, the fall of the Philippines, the humiliation of the British Navy in Singapore, the capture of oil fields in the Indies, all seemed to confirm Japan's strategic genius. Even after the setback at Midway, High Command clung to the belief that a single future battle could reverse their fortunes. Submarines remained tools of reconnaissance, not commerce raiders, and protecting merchant shipping was seen as a secondary task, a distraction from the real war. But war is never kind to those who underestimate its invisible fronts. By late 1942, the first ripples of change began. The U.S. Navy's technical failures were being solved. Engineers on both coasts worked relentlessly to fix torpedo detonators. New sonar systems improved detection, and American commanders, like Charles Lockwood and Thomas C. Kincaid, began reshaping strategy. No longer would submarines chase enemy warships. Their mission would shift toward something far more devastating, strangling Japan's supply lines. The Americans called it unrestricted submarine warfare. It was a harsh, total form of combat, targeting every vessel that sustained Japan's military and civilian life alike. It mirrored what the Germans had done in the Atlantic, but now it would unfold in the vast Pacific, a theater too wide for Japan to guard. As 1943 dawned, U.S. submarines grew more efficient, better armed, and more coordinated. New fleet boats like the Gato and Balao classes extended their reach deep into enemy waters. One by one, they began to strike at the lifelines that bound Japan's empire together. Yet in Tokyo's war rooms, few understood the scale of what was coming. They still looked to battleships and carriers, to admirals and glory, not to the unseen threat beneath the waves. The war Japan had planned was one of open seas and visible victories. But the war it was about to face would come from the darkness below, silent, patient, and merciless. When the Japanese Empire reached its greatest extent in early 1943, it appeared unstoppable. From the shores of Burma to the islands of the Solomons, Japan's banners flew over an empire that stretched across nearly 1/3 of the globe. Yet beneath that surface of triumph lay a quiet mathematical truth. Every victory demanded distance. Every mile of ocean between Japan and its occupied territories was a thread in a fragile web, and each thread carried the lifeblood of the empire. Japan's home islands were resource poor. They produced almost no oil, little rubber, and limited iron. The entire war effort, every aircraft, tank, and warship, depended on raw materials shipped from newly conquered territories. Oil from Borneo and Sumatra, bauxite from the Dutch East Indies, tin from Malaya, and rice from Indochina all had to be carried across vast, dangerous seas. By 1943, Japan had roughly 6 million tons of merchant shipping, a fleet that seemed large enough to sustain the empire's appetite. But those ships were spread across immense distances, forced to serve military and civilian needs alike. The routes they followed, from Balikpapan to Yokohama, from Singapore to Moji, became arteries pulsing with critical cargo. Without them, Japan's factories would starve. Its fleets would grind to a halt. And yet, despite the centrality of these shipping lines, Japan's naval leadership treated them as an afterthought. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been trained and organized for offense, not defense. Protecting supply convoys was seen as the work of lesser nations. Escort ships, the corvettes and destroyer escorts that guarded Allied convoys in the Atlantic, were almost non-existent. In early 1943, Japan had barely 200 vessels capable of anti-submarine duty, and many of those were outdated or diverted to frontline combat. Convoy doctrine itself was underdeveloped. Merchant ships often sailed alone or in small, poorly coordinated groups. Radio discipline was lax. Navigation was predictable. When attacked, ships scattered in panic rather than forming defensive screens. And while radar had transformed Allied naval warfare, Japan's adoption of the technology lagged far behind. In the first years of the war, this weakness went largely unnoticed. American submarines, still plagued by malfunctioning torpedoes, were more nuisance than nightmare. Convoy commanders grew complacent. They believed that distance, size, and the sheer expanse of the Pacific would shield them. But geography, once Japan's greatest defense, was becoming its greatest enemy. To sustain its empire, Japan had to move more than 20 million barrels of oil annually from Southeast Asia to its home islands. Each tanker voyage took weeks, often passing through narrow choke points like the South China Sea, the Luzon Strait, or the East China Sea, waters that could not be everywhere patrolled. Even one successful submarine lurking in those lanes could cripple entire months of supply. Meanwhile, Japan's war industry demanded more than the sea could safely provide. Air operations in New Guinea and the Solomons consumed thousands of tons of fuel daily. The Imperial Navy's fleet maneuvers, already strained by losses, became increasingly limited by fuel shortages. By mid-1943, some carrier task forces were being ordered to conserve fuel by remaining anchored rather than patrolling. Still, Tokyo's naval leadership hesitated to confront the crisis. To them, supply was not strategy. They saw it as logistics, a problem for merchants, not admirals. Official reports warning of shipping shortages were ignored or delayed. Rear Admiral Shigeru Fukudomi, one of the few to raise concerns, was told bluntly, The Navy fights to win battles, not to guard cargo ships. This mindset would prove catastrophic. While Japan dismissed its supply vulnerability, the United States was learning from every engagement. American submarines began to receive updated torpedoes, better periscopes, and long-range intelligence derived from code-breaking operations. By decoding Japanese naval traffic, U.S. commanders identified convoy routes, sailing times, and cargo manifests with increasing precision. In 1943, U.S. submarines sank roughly 600,000 tons of Japanese shipping, still only a fraction of Japan's total. But it was the beginning of an exponential curve. Each ship lost was not just steel and crew. It was fuel never delivered, ammunition never fired, rice never eaten. The Japanese public never saw the scale of the problem. Reports were censored. Newspapers spoke of temporary disruptions, never of shortages. But by late 1943, whispers reached the factories. Fuel reserves were dwindling, and some air units were already rationing training flights. The Imperial Navy still clung to its dream of a decisive surface battle, a final clash that would restore control of the Pacific. But the battle it refused to fight was already underway, invisible and relentless beneath the waves. By the end of 1943, Japan's empire stood at the height of its reach, but also on the edge of starvation. The ships that fed it were disappearing one by one, and few within its high command truly understood why. The stage was set for a new kind of warfare, one waged not by admirals commanding fleets but by small crews operating silently in the depths. And soon the hunters would begin to close in. For every ship sunk in the Pacific there were human faces, men who lived, fought, and vanished into the sea. On the surface, Japanese merchant sailors bore the burden of a war they did not start. Many were civilians, drawn from fishing villages and trading ports, now conscripted to man cargo ships loaded with fuel and food. Their vessels were slow, their protection thin. Few had lifeboats enough for all aboard. Each voyage was a gamble across a vast ocean, haunted by whispers of submarines that struck without warning. When the torpedoes came, there was rarely time to react. Survivors recalled seeing walls of fire rising from ruptured tankers, hearing the screams of crewmates swallowed by burning oil. The Imperial Navy's officers called them necessary losses. But for the families left behind in Osaka, Kobe, and Nagasaki, each loss was a name erased quietly from the registry, a disappearance with no grave. Below the waves, the men of the U.S. Navy's silent service lived another kind of existence, one of constant strain and suffocating patience. The average submarine held 80 men packed in steel corridors no longer than a freight train car. The air was heavy with diesel, sweat, and fear. Silence was survival. Every sound, a dropped wrench, a creaking pipe, could mean discovery. Submariners often called themselves the orphans of the Navy. Their missions were classified, their achievements seldom publicized. They fought alone, unseen, thousands of miles from home. And yet it was these unseen men, navigating blind through darkness, counting seconds between sonar pings, who would change the shape of the Pacific War. For both sides, the ocean became a paradox. Vast yet claustrophobic, silent yet deadly. The surface shimmered with sunlight and illusion. Beneath it, death moved unseen. At the heart of this transformation lay technology. Not glamorous fleets or mighty guns, but the quiet evolution of machinery. When the Pacific War began, American torpedoes were notoriously unreliable. Commanders like Dudley Mush-Morton and Charles Lockwood spent months filing desperate complaints to Washington. Torpedoes ran too deep, failed to detonate, or circled back toward their own submarines. For nearly 2 years, these mechanical failures robbed U.S. submariners of victory and credibility. But by mid-1943, everything changed. After relentless testing and field trials, many carried out secretly in Pearl Harbor's harbors, the flaws were identified and corrected. The Mark 14 torpedo, once cursed, now struck with terrifying accuracy. Alongside these fixes came new tools. Improved periscopes gave clearer, longer-range visibility. New sonar systems developed at the U.S. Naval Research Laboratory allowed submarines to detect propeller noises miles away. Radar, compact and reliable, transformed navigation even in storms or darkness. Japanese submarines, though advanced in design, failed to evolve. Their Type B-1 boats could carry float planes and reach extraordinary ranges, but their doctrine remained outdated. They were used for scouting or attacking warships, rarely against merchant fleets. Japan's anti-submarine warfare (ASW) systems lagged behind. Their sonar sets were primitive, their depth charges weak and poorly fused. Technology was shifting the balance, but not through spectacle. Unlike the thunder of carrier battles or the flash of artillery, submarine warfare thrived on invisibility. Victory here was measured not in captured islands but in numbers unseen. Cargo tonnage sunk, fuel denied, factories starved. By late 1943, that invisible arithmetic was beginning to turn decisively against Japan. With better weapons and sharper intelligence, the Americans began to reinvent how the undersea war was fought. They borrowed a concept from their German counterparts in the Atlantic, the Wolf Pack, coordinated groups of submarines working together to ambush enemy convoys. Until then, submarines had hunted alone, striking whenever opportunity arose. But Admiral Charles Lockwood and his commanders saw potential in coordination. Using radio intercepts and patrol patterns, they began directing multiple submarines to choke points, narrow stretches like the Luzon Strait, the East China Sea and the South China Sea, where Japan's convoys had no room to maneuver. These wolf packs turned the Pacific into a killing ground. Submarines like USS Tang, USS Darter, and USS Dace formed teams that attacked from multiple angles, overwhelming escort defenses. Convoy commanders, untrained and unequipped for such tactics, were often paralyzed. Depth charges fell blindly into the sea as submarines slipped away beneath the thermocline, the ocean's natural sound barrier. Each engagement refined the art further. By 1944, submarine patrols were no longer random. They were orchestrated with intelligence precision. Allied codebreakers at Pearl Harbor's Station Hypo provided convoy schedules and routes almost in real time. Some U.S. skippers began referring to their patrol maps as menus, lists of targets waiting to be served. For Japan, the results were devastating. Convoy losses rose month after month. Entire tanker fleets disappeared. One sinking could erase the fuel reserves of a whole naval base. And still, Tokyo's response lagged behind. By the end of 1943, the U.S. Navy's submarine force, and just 2% of the fleet's manpower, was sinking more Japanese tonnage than all other weapons combined. Yet few outside the submarine service understood it. There were no headlines, no parades, no grand naval duels, just the steady, silent erosion of an empire. The torpedoes, the tactics, and the men had changed, but Japan's mindset had not. Its admirals still spoke of glory, decisive battles, and victory through courage. They could not yet see that the enemy had already changed the rules of war. By 1943, the Japanese Navy's command structure had become a mirror of its own rigid traditions, brilliant in surface warfare, blind in logistics. At the top stood Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. A visionary strategist in many ways, Yamamoto had foreseen that Japan's early victories could not be sustained. He once warned that Japan had only 6 months of unchecked success before American industry would turn the tide. Yet even Yamamoto, bound by the Kantai-Kessen doctrine, failed to reshape naval priorities. Submarines remained fleet scouts. Merchant protection remained a neglected afterthought. After Yamamoto's death in 1943, the Navy's leadership fell to men like Admiral Minechi Koga and later Soemu Toyota, both competent but conservative. Their focus remained fixed on the coming decisive battle in the Central Pacific, a grand engagement that never came. Resources were poured into maintaining fleet carriers and battleships even as tankers and cargo ships vanished beneath the waves. Within the Imperial Navy's staff offices in Tokyo, warnings mounted. Rear Admiral Tomiji Koyanagi's reports on shipping losses painted a grim picture. 1,000 tons lost here, 2,000 there. But they were buried under optimism and pride. Convoy protection was seen as defensive, and in Japan's military culture, defense was synonymous with weakness. When the United States began deploying wolf packs across key supply routes, the Imperial Navy's response was fragmented. Commanders in Singapore and Manila requested additional escorts. Their appeals were delayed or ignored. Orders from Tokyo emphasized offensive submarine operations near Australia rather than protecting merchant convoys. The disconnect between doctrine and reality grew wider with each passing month. It was not that Japan lacked intelligence, and it lacked humility. The same pride that had propelled its early victories now blinded its leadership to the quiet devastation unfolding beneath the waves. By the time Japan recognized the crisis, the damage was beyond repair. In Washington, Pearl Harbor, and Brisbane, another war was being fought, not with torpedoes but with information. American cryptographers had been working relentlessly since the first days of the conflict to crack Japan's naval codes. By 1943, their efforts began to bear fruit. The Japanese Navy's JN-25 code, used to coordinate fleet and convoy movements, had been partially broken. Intelligence units, including Station Hypo in Hawaii and Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, FRUMEL, were intercepting, decrypting, and analyzing Japanese radio traffic with increasing accuracy. Each intercepted message told a story: departure times, routes, cargo manifests, even the tonnage of specific ships. These details were fed directly to submarine flotillas operating across the Pacific. Commanders no longer hunted blindly. They knew where to wait. Convoys sailing from Balikpapan to Yokohama, laden with oil, were ambushed with surgical precision. Those leaving Singapore or Palembang found their escorts overwhelmed by submarines that seemed to know their every move. The success of these operations owed as much to the men behind desks as to those beneath the sea. Codebreakers, analysts, and radio operators became the unseen crew of every submarine that sailed. Together they turned intelligence into lethality. Meanwhile, Japan's counterintelligence efforts lagged behind. Cryptographic security was often neglected. Officers reused phrases or failed to update encryption tables. Some messages, incredibly, were transmitted in plain language. Tokyo believed distance was its best protection, that the ocean itself would shield its secrets. But the Pacific had ears. By mid-1944, U.S. intelligence operations had mapped almost every major convoy route. Each sinking was not random chance. It was a calculated strike born from months of observation and analysis. Japan's supply war was being lost not just at sea, but in silence, in rooms filled with typewriters, headphones, and the rhythmic tapping of decoded transmissions. Submarine warfare by its nature leaves little room for mercy. It was a form of combat designed to break not armies but societies, to cut the arteries of a nation until it starved. For Japan, this meant a slow and invisible suffering. Merchant sailors who survived attacks were rarely rescued. American submarines, following orders of unrestricted warfare, were not to surface for survivors. The risk of ambush or counterattack was too great. As the war dragged on, the seas between the Philippines and Japan became graveyards of drifting debris and silent oil fires. Inside Japan, the effects were devastating but hidden. Factories shut down for lack of fuel. Power stations went dark. Civilians faced hunger as rice imports collapsed. The government maintained a facade of control, censoring reports of shipping losses. But rumors spread, of entire convoys gone missing, of families waiting at docks for ships that would never return. Among U.S. submarine crews, there was pride but also unease. Many knew they were not merely sinking ships, they were strangling an entire nation. The moral weight of that mission lingered long after victory. Veterans spoke of the eerie quiet after a sinking, of oil and wreckage rising to the surface, of knowing hundreds had just died unseen. It was like fighting ghosts, one officer later recalled. This was not war as the world had known it. No grand battles, no surrender ceremonies. It was annihilation through absence, through starvation and fuel exhaustion. By the time the scale of destruction became clear, Japan's seas had already turned against it. The empire's lifelines were gone, and with them its future. The leadership's denial, the enemy's intelligence, and the moral cost of victory all converged toward a single outcome: a silent collapse that no admiral could stop. The next chapter of this story would not be about warnings or theories. It would be about the breaking point itself, when the empire's ships vanished faster than it could replace them, and the war beneath the waves reached its peak. By early 1944, Japan's war machine was running on fumes. The empire still stretched from Burma to the Pacific Islands, but its industrial heart, the factories, refineries, and shipyards, was starving. The ships that once carried oil and ore now lay shattered on the ocean floor. In Tokyo, the numbers told a story few dared to read aloud. Merchant tonnage had dropped by nearly a third in just 12 months. Tankers, especially, were disappearing faster than they could be built. Yet the high command clung to optimism, believing that new victories in the Philippines or the Marianas could reverse their fate. They were wrong. The real battle was already lost beneath the sea. From the bases at Fremantle, Midway, and Pearl Harbor, waves of U.S. submarines fanned out across the Pacific. Their orders were clear: cut Japan's lifelines. The submariners called it the Tonnage War, an unending hunt for merchant ships carrying the Empire's lifeblood. The Pacific was now mapped like a chessboard. Every major route, from Borneo to Formosa, from Singapore to Moji, had designated hunting zones. Submarines patrolled in rotation, ensuring that no convoy could sail unobserved. By spring 1944, the sea lanes once considered safe had become killing grounds. Convoy after convoy met disaster. In March, USS Tunny torpedoed and sank the Japanese carrier Unyo off Luzon. In April, USS Jack destroyed 6 tankers in a single patrol, a record that stunned even U.S. Navy command. That same month, USS Flasher struck a convoy south of the South China Sea, sending 3 freighters and a destroyer to the bottom within minutes. Each sinking rippled through Japan's war economy. When the Unyo went down, aircraft production stalled for weeks. When Jack's torpedoes sank tankers carrying Borneo oil, entire naval squadrons were grounded. Japan had the ships and men to fight, but not the fuel to move them. Meanwhile, American coordination had reached new heights. Codebreakers at Station Hypo provided convoy intelligence with deadly precision. U.S. patrol groups intercepted radio transmissions, tracked merchant movements, and plotted intercepts like clockwork. Each patrol was part of a larger plan, a systematic strangulation of the Empire's arteries. In the summer of 1944, the U.S. launched one of the most decisive campaigns of the Pacific, the drive to retake the Philippines. But even before the first landings, the submarines had already won half that battle. Japan's supply routes to the archipelago had been shattered. Troops were stranded without reinforcements. Ammunition and fuel shipments simply never arrived. The devastation reached a new level in August 1944, during the tragedy of Convoy High 71. Sailing from Singapore to Japan, it carried troops, oil, and military cargo, over 20 ships escorted by destroyers and corvettes. The convoy's position was betrayed by radio intercepts, and soon 3 American submarines, USS Redfish, USS Spadefish, and USS Rasher, converged in the dark waters of the Luzon Strait. Just after midnight, Rasher fired first. A torpedo slammed into the transport Taya Maru, a former luxury liner turned troopship. Within minutes it was gone, taking over 2,600 men with it. Moments later, Rasher's next salvo struck the Taiho Maru and Teo Maru, both laden with vital oil supplies. Flames lit the sea for miles. Survivors clung to wreckage, watching their fleet vanish one ship at a time. By dawn, 6 Japanese ships lay burning or sunk. Of the convoy's total tonnage, nearly 2/3 was destroyed in a single night. It was one of the worst maritime disasters in Japanese history, and a symbol of a war that could no longer be sustained. Reports reached Tokyo days later. Numbers were sanitized, details omitted. Official bulletins called it a temporary setback. But within the naval staff, the shock was profound. Even the most loyal officers could see the pattern. Convoy High 81, High 87, High 97 all suffered similar fates. Each month, another artery was cut. The psychological toll was immense. Japanese merchant captains began to dread the night sea. Crews painted ships black, sailed without lights, and hugged coastlines. All futile gestures against an enemy they could not see. For every 10 ships Japan launched, 7 were lost within months. Admiral Suemu Toyota ordered the creation of Kaibokan escort groups, a last-ditch attempt to protect what was left. New anti-submarine ships were rushed into production, but the industrial base could no longer sustain them. Japan's fuel reserves were collapsing. The very fuel needed to power escort ships had to be rationed. By the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the so-called Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Japan's naval defeat was already written in oil. Carriers like Shokaku and Taiho went into battle half-fueled, their aircraft untrained due to fuel shortages. Both were later sunk by American submarines, Kavala and Albacore, in the same campaign. Each explosion beneath those ships was more than tactical victory. It was symbolic. The ocean that had carried Japan to greatness was now turning against it. By late 1944, the Empire's once mighty fleets could barely sail. Submarines had turned Japan's seas into cages. The decisive battle doctrine, forged in pride and tradition, had been undone not by grand fleets or surface duels, but by shadows beneath the surface hunting silently, night after night. By the final months of 1944, Japan's maritime map, once a web of proud trade routes stretching across Asia, had become a graveyard. From the South China Sea to the approaches of Kyushu, the ocean was littered with rusting hulks. Every month brought fresh reports of sinkings, each one tightening the noose. The statistics told a chilling truth. In 1942, Japan had moved over 10 million tons of cargo across the Pacific. By the end of 1944, that figure had fallen below 3 million. And worse, only a fraction of it reached its destination. Oil was the first casualty. Tankers that once carried crude from Borneo, Sumatra, and Palembang were disappearing faster than shipyards could replace them. By December, Japan's oil imports had collapsed by more than 90%. Entire naval divisions sat idle, their ships moored indefinitely. Destroyers were cannibalized for parts. Cruisers remained docked, their fuel rationed for emergencies only. The Imperial Navy, once the world's third largest, was now a collection of stranded giants. Even training flights for young pilots were curtailed. Aircraft stood in neat rows on airfields, their fuel tanks bone dry. Engines were run once a week simply to keep them from seizing. At sea, the American submarines continued their methodical hunt. By this time, the campaign had evolved into an exact science. The U.S. Navy's wolf packs, groups of 3 to 5 submarines, roamed in coordinated formations. Radar, improved torpedoes, and aerial reconnaissance gave them deadly reach. The once problematic Mark 14 torpedo had been perfected. Its magnetic exploders now detonated reliably beneath keels, breaking ships clean in half. In November 1944, USS Archerfish tracked a large target northeast of Luzon. The submarine's commander, Joseph Enright, stalked it for hours before firing 6 torpedoes. 4 hit home. The target, Japan's largest aircraft carrier, Shinano, rolled over and sank within 7 hours. It had been on its maiden voyage, never having launched a single plane. The loss shocked the Imperial Navy. It was the world's biggest warship ever sunk by a submarine. But the sinking of Shinano was more than a tactical blow. It was symbolic of Japan's new reality. The empire could no longer protect even its most vital assets. Every departure from port was a gamble. Convoys that once sailed in disciplined lines now scattered at the first hint of radar contact. Escort ships dropped depth charges into empty waters, chasing phantoms. Every echo on sonar was treated as a threat. The fear was constant when justified. In early 1945, the submarine campaign reached its peak. U.S. boats prowled within sight of the Japanese coast, cutting off the last arteries of trade. Submarines like USS Sea Owl, USS Barb, and USS Bluefish roamed the East China Sea, torpedoing ships almost daily. Merchant losses were so catastrophic that Japan began using wooden sail-powered vessels to move coal and rice between its islands. Even these were hunted. The USS Barb under Commander Eugene Fluckey went further, launching daring coastal raids on railways and shore installations. In January 1945, Fluckey's crew destroyed a Japanese train by landing a demolition team on Hokkaido's coast, the only ground combat operation by U.S. forces on the Japanese mainland during the war. It was a sign of how completely submarines now dominated Japan's coastal waters. Meanwhile, Tokyo's shipping ministry was collapsing under the weight of reality. Reports detailed that over 85% of Japan's merchant fleet had been destroyed. In some months, losses exceeded new construction by a ratio of 10 to 1. The empire had built over 6 million tons of shipping before the war. By early 1945, less than 1 million remained afloat. Admiral Toyota and the surviving naval leadership pleaded for solutions, air cover, minesweeping, convoy reforms. But there was no longer fuel, steel, or time. The home islands were now isolated fortresses, surrounded by the sea they once commanded. American commanders, too, recognized the scale of what they had achieved. Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz described the submarine campaign as the most complete victory ever achieved by any force in naval history. In barely 3 years, U.S. submarines, only 2% of the Navy's personnel, had destroyed more than 55% of Japan's merchant tonnage. They had sunk 1,178 ships, including 8 aircraft carriers, 11 cruisers, and countless destroyers. The Japanese economy imploded. Factories ran dry. Food shortages became starvation. Coal reserves dwindled so low that trains stopped running. Millions of civilians faced a winter without heat. By the summer of 1945, Japan's ocean empire was gone. Its conquests in Southeast Asia were still on the map, but they were ghosts. Without ships, those territories might as well have been on another planet. Even the kamikaze campaign, Japan's desperate final weapon, was shaped by the submarine blockade. With no fuel for sustained operations, the Empire turned to one-way missions, trading pilots for drops of oil. When the war finally ended in August 1945, Japanese admirals walked through their silent harbors, past rows of half-sunken ships and oil-slicked water. The silence was deafening. They had prepared for great naval battles, for duels of carriers and cruisers, but not for a war of attrition fought by unseen hunters in the deep. The Pacific, once their empire's bridge, had become its tomb. By early 1945, the Pacific Ocean, once Japan's proud highway of conquest, had become an open wound. The imperial flag still flew over far-flung outposts in Borneo, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies, but they were islands of starvation. The ocean that had connected them to Tokyo had vanished beneath the waves, replaced by wreckage, oil slicks, and drifting corpses. For Japan's war planners, the collapse of the merchant fleet was not just a logistical failure, it was the quiet death of the empire itself. Factories across the home islands ground to a halt. The once mighty steel industry in Yawata, which had powered Japan's military expansion for decades, faced crippling shortages of coal and ore. Train shipments slowed, then stopped entirely. Engineers dismantled rails to melt into weapons. Locomotives stood rusting in silent yards. The Navy's shipyards, too, became graveyards. The Kure and Yokosuka arsenals still housed hulls under construction, destroyers, escorts, even unfinished carriers. But they lacked steel, rivets, and fuel to complete them. Workers scavenged scrap from bombed-out factories, trying to assemble machines for a war that no longer had the means to fight. The oil crisis was absolute. By February 1945, Japan's remaining oil reserves amounted to barely 5 million barrels, less than what the empire consumed in a single month during 1942. Naval operations were restricted to local waters. Even submarines were ordered to remain docked unless targets were guaranteed. The army suffered equally. Troops stationed in China, Burma, and the Pacific Islands had been cut off entirely. Tens of thousands died not in battle but from starvation and disease. Malaria, dysentery, and malnutrition consumed entire garrisons. At Rabaul, once a fortress of 100,000 men, Japanese soldiers lived off jungle roots and rats. No ship had reached them in over a year. For the men who had dreamed of defending the empire's perimeter, the sea had become an invisible wall. For civilians at home, the submarine blockade was an unseen but ever-present terror. Coal shortages left cities dark at night. Rice rations dwindled to half. Fishing boats no longer dared venture far from shore. Many that did never returned. Even domestic shipping along Japan's coast fell victim to American submarines that now prowled within sight of land. In the ports of Kobe, Moji, and Nagasaki, dock workers watched as wreck after wreck was towed in. Broken hulls leaking oil and seawater, their decks covered in blackened debris. The smell of salt and death hung over every harbor. Official propaganda tried to disguise the truth. Newspapers spoke of temporary difficulties and strategic readjustments, but ordinary people could see it in their kitchens, in their cold homes, and in the silence of empty markets. The military attempted desperate solutions. Fishing vessels were converted into makeshift transports. Barges were linked into crude convoys. Even these were sunk within weeks. Mines, patrol planes, and coastal defenses could not stop the invisible enemy beneath the sea. For Japan's naval officers, it was a bitter realization. The empire had invested decades in the dream of decisive surface battles, massive fleets of battleships and carriers clashing in honor and glory. But the Americans had chosen a quieter, more merciless strategy, to starve the empire, not simply defeat it. The submarines had done what bombing raids and invasions could not. They had strangled Japan's ability to fight. By April 1945, even before the atomic bombs, Japan was already on the edge of collapse. Half its population faced hunger. The army was trapped abroad. The navy had no oil. And its economy, once a marvel of industrial ambition, was paralyzed. The unseen war beneath the ocean had become the most decisive campaign of the entire Pacific conflict. And yet, amidst the devastation, few Japanese citizens understood what had truly happened. They had seen the flames of Tokyo's firebombing. They had heard of Okinawa's horror. But the silent war beneath the waves was invisible. Its victories were unseen, its victims uncounted. For every Japanese soldier who died in combat, another died waiting for a ship that never came. For every tank that was built, there was no fuel to move it. For every aircraft produced, there was no oil to lift it into the sky. The empire that had risen on maritime power was undone not by armies but by arithmetic, by the simple equation of ships lost faster than they could be built. The last convoys of 1945 sailed under desperate orders. Some reached home escorted by dwindling fuel and fading hope, but most did not. Their wrecks still lie scattered across the Pacific, rusting beneath the silence that ended the empire's dream. From the depths the submarines surfaced, not to fight but to witness what they had accomplished. The war beneath the waves was nearly over. Japan's defeat was now inevitable, and as Tokyo braced for its final months, one haunting question remained. Could the empire have been saved if its leaders had understood, too late, that the ocean they ruled could also betray them? By the summer of 1945, Japan was a nation surrounded not only by enemy fleets but by emptiness. The shipping lanes that had once stretched like lifelines across Asia were gone. The sea, once a bridge, had become a wall of isolation. Every attempt to move supplies, troops, or even food ended in disaster. The blockade was total. Submarines, mines, and air patrols worked in perfect coordination. From the Philippines to the Yellow Sea, every approach to the Japanese islands was covered. Even small coastal freighters could not move without risk. The empire that had conquered through mobility now found itself frozen in place. By May 1945, Japan's oil stockpile had fallen to less than 2 weeks of wartime use. The Navy was effectively immobilized. Warships that once symbolized imperial pride, the Yamato, Nagato, Haruna, and Ise, remained anchored, unable to sail for lack of fuel. The great battleship Yamato's final voyage in April 1945 was itself a suicide mission, a one-way charge toward Okinawa with barely enough oil to reach the island. It was sunk by American aircraft long before it arrived, a floating monument to a vanished era. Japan's leaders still spoke of honor, of resistance, of divine winds, but beneath the rhetoric they understood the truth. The submarine blockade had cut out the empire's heart. Factories were quiet, cities starved, and the sea, once their protector, was now a field of death. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, they were not the beginning of Japan's defeat. They were its final punctuation. The empire had already been broken by starvation, exhaustion, and the slow suffocation of its maritime arteries. In the days following the surrender, American officers walking through Japanese ports found a landscape of ruin. Dozens of half-sunken freighters lay rusting in shallow water. Fuel tanks were dry. Coal yards were empty. In shipyards once filled with noise and smoke, the silence was haunting. The official records later confirmed what the Japanese admirals already knew. Out of 3 million tons of merchant shipping, more than 9 million tons had been sunk, most of it by submarines. Entire fleets of tankers, troop ships, and transports were gone. The empire's economy had been dismantled from beneath. The human toll was equally staggering. Tens of thousands of sailors and civilians had perished at sea, burned, drowned, or lost without trace. Their families received no graves, only telegrams. For many, the ocean itself became their memorial. In post-war interrogations, several Japanese naval officers admitted that the submarine threat had been fatally underestimated. Admiral Toyota, head of the combined fleet in 1944, confessed, "We thought of war in terms of battleships and carriers. We did not understand that a nation's strength lies also in its transport." Others echoed his regret. Captain Tamura of the Shipping Command described the Navy's obsession with offensive glory. "We built weapons to destroy, but not to survive. We never prepared to protect what fed us. It was a revelation too late." The U.S. Navy, reviewing its wartime data, called the submarine campaign the most decisive factor in the Pacific War after air power. The submariners, a mere 16,000 men, less than 2% of the Navy, had inflicted more than half of Japan's total shipping losses. What bombers burned, submarines starved. Together they ended a war that Japan could no longer afford to fight. By 1946, Japan's surviving ships were repurposed for civilian use, many under Allied supervision. The empire's proud naval tradition was dissolved. In place of battleships came merchant vessels once again, carrying not soldiers but supplies for rebuilding. Yet even as peace returned, the lessons of the blockade lingered. Japanese engineers and naval historians studied the campaign for decades afterward. They concluded that the empire's defeat was not simply military, it was strategic blindness. The belief in invincibility, in the ocean as an eternal shield, had been their undoing. The submarines had revealed a truth far more profound than victory or defeat. In modern war, the line between strength and vulnerability lies not in fleets or fortresses, but in the fragile flow of supply. As the sun set over Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945, the Japanese delegation signed the instruments of surrender aboard the USS Missouri. In that same bay, just beneath the calm surface, lay the wreckage of ships that once carried the Empire's dreams. The war was over. The sea was silent once more, but in that silence, the echoes of the submarines and the lessons they brought would never fade. The story of Japan's lost supply lines is not just a chronicle of ships sunk or tonnage destroyed. It is the story of an idea, the belief that strength alone could defy geography, that courage could overcome the mathematics of war. For centuries, Japan's destiny had been tied to the sea. The ocean had protected it, nourished it, and carried its ambitions across Asia. But in the Pacific War, that same ocean turned into a mirror, one that reflected the empire's greatest illusion. The admirals who once dreamed of decisive battles never saw the danger rising from below. They measured power in battleships and carriers, not in convoys and cargo. Yet in the end, it was not grand engagements that decided the war. It was the unseen war beneath the surface, waged by men in narrow steel tubes, guided only by sonar and silence. The submarines did not seek glory. Their victories had no parades, no banners, no cheers. Only the dull thud of torpedoes and the cold hiss of bubbles rising through the dark. But their impact was absolute. They proved that an empire's fate could be sealed not in one battle, but through the quiet erosion of its lifelines. When Japan surrendered, it was not simply the end of a war, it was the end of an age where nations believed that conquest could be sustained by will alone, where oceans were boundaries to be conquered, not forces to be respected. In the decades that followed, Japan rebuilt, not through expansion but through trade. Ships once meant for war carried food, technology, and ideas. The sea, once a theater of death, became a bridge again. Perhaps that was the truest legacy of all, that the empire which fell to the silence of submarines would rise again by embracing peace upon the same waters. History remembers the explosions, the battles, the names of admirals and ships, but sometimes the most decisive victories are the quietest ones, won not with thunder but with patience, precision, and the understanding that even the mightiest empire can drown in its own blind faith.